looking about right. Hi and good morning, and welcome to Honeydale. Today we're looking at the benefit of some deep rooting legumes which we're going to sow at this farm next month. It's a little bit cold today and we're just making sure that our soil conditions are just right. And during the winter we've been talking about seed mixtures to a number of groups across this country, and also one or two international symposiums, and we'd like to just capture what we've been talking about today in this short video, because what we're saying about legumes and seed mixtures just makes so much sense at the moment, and I hope that you'll follow this little story for the next few minutes with us. See, the importance of this stuff is where it all starts. So what we're going to cover is the importance of the soil and the effect we can have on it. We're also going to talk about the effect that some of these wonderful legumes can have from a livestock farming point of view and how it can produce healthy livestock. And then finally, we're going to see what effect it has on leaving some money in the bank. So I'm going to start by talking about soil and the importance of it. Now, when we were thinking about putting our presentation together over the winter, we Googled and we came up with some really funny images, but it got our minds thinking as to how we might show the importance of roots to plants and the connection that they have with the soil. And we came across these two rabbits, and I think you'll agree that the expressions on these rabbits' faces would be completely reversed if they could see what was below the ground. And that's the thing with plants, you know, what we see above the surface is only 50% of the story. The other half, which is invisible to us, is of so much importance. Being a seed merchant is a fantastic job. We're often asked to provide plant species in the form of seed to meet different requirements from a farming point of view. Now, with the seeds that we're talking about, which is grasses, legumes and herbs, it's impossible for one species to provide all the answers. And so we combine different species together to provide flexible, robust seed mixtures for the end purpose. And it's interesting when you think about it, because certainly for most of my career, which spans about 30 years, we've used just one single species as our principal grass, and that's ryegrass. See, ryegrass is a really good species, and it does provide some of the things that we need. For example, it's very easy to establish, it's relatively cheap seed. But it isn't deep rooting, it doesn't fix nitrogen, and it's not rich in protein. Nor does it provide pollinators with food. Whilst ryegrass meets some of our requirements, we can provide a lot more by using different species. If we add red clover, for example, to our seed mix of ryegrass, we suddenly provide for pollinators. We add a deeper root structure. We can fix nitrogen into the soil. If we go further and add another plant with a completely different range of characteristics, like a herb, for example, in this case chicory, we can provide even deeper roots. And you'll find as time goes on that by using a number of species, the life in the soil just increases. So not only are we adding nitrogen into the soil, not only are we adding fertility and structure to the soil, we're also increasing the number of earthworms, protozoa, nematodes, and masses and masses of soil life. You can't do that with one single species. When I was at agricultural college, I remember struggling to identify different grasses. So it came as some relief many years later that when I read about Charles Darwin, he also struggled with grasses. And Darwin's really interesting to me because as a seed merchant, he recognised 200 years ago what was happening when different plants grew in the environment. Now, two different species or more together produce more yield. And Darwin wrote about this in The Origin of Species. And it's really interesting because that's one of the key reasons that farmers grow crops is to produce more yield. And Darwin was one of the first people to spot it. If we take those three species that we just looked at, the ryegrass, the chicory and the red clover, for example, and we look at the potential yield of each of them, it would be very logical to assume that if we put them all together and then average the yield, in other words, we take our three individual yield species, divide them by 3, our yield would be this. But that's not what happens. What actually happens is this. This is the Darwin effect. And this over-yielding factor comes as a result of different plants overlapping each other in terms of both their space, their root depth, their aerial growth, and in terms of the time that they grow in. Some grow very early in the spring, some grow very late. And provided you combine different plant species together, these are ones with really different characteristics, you get a tremendous over-yielding effect. This has been proven many times in science, and the most recent scientific experiments across the whole of Northern Europe on 1,300 different sites showed that the over-yielding effect in both high and low nitrogen situations was around 47%. That's nearly half as much again than compared to by using a single species. And so for me, using mixtures is just such common sense. It works. It provides extra yield, it improves the soil quality, it provides very healthy forage, and it's a sustainable way forward. It's also really cheap, and we're going to come to that a bit later on. I want to turn our attention away a little bit from talking about the soil towards looking at the effect that these plants can have on our livestock. These plants are really healthy, and the best way I can illustrate this is to give you some farmer experiences in their own words, and you'll see what I mean.
I started growing red clover in the year 2000. This is now the 4th year of this lay, and last year, after 2 of the hardest winters we've had in 30 years, this field with no nitrogen fertiliser, with P&K and a coating of chicken muck, produced 135 bales of silage, which would average about 700 kilos probably in weight. That's in 3 cuts. I had every cut analysed. It was 18.6 protein, 18.2 protein and 16.8 protein. So I didn't think I'd ever beat that with any other crop that I could grow on the farm.
Desperate for rain all year, and the grass didn't grow, but this did. But I didn't do anything to it, and look at it now. You know, it's brilliant. No, I'm very pleased with this, and we shall go on growing it, and I can't understand why more farmers don't grow lucerne, because it's, you know, in a dry year it's brilliant. And last year this is what saved us from being completely out of food.
It's bloat free, it's got high level of protein, and animals, because of the digestibility of the bloat, they'll grow faster on this than any other known forage crop. And yet it remains the Cinderella of British farming. Most extraordinary.
So there you have it. And that's why these things are so popular with livestock farmers. These crops with different species in are just so much better in many respects. They're more palatable, they have higher protein content than just using a monoculture ryegrass. But in order for them to work like this, you have to have a good proportion of each type of plant in a mix. So for example, when it comes to legumes, you need 30, 40, maybe 50% of legumes in the sward. Otherwise, there just isn't enough to provide the protein or to fix enough nitrogen. We know through scientific work over many years that these plants, when they're fed to sheep for fattening lambs, or when they're fed to cattle or dairy cows, increased palatability of them means higher intake. And of course that higher intake, which is one of the restricting factors to growth, means more growth. And that's why you get more livestock production, more meat production, and why you get more milk production when you have these complex mixtures. This slide illustrates the extra growth that you get with clover in a mixture. And this sort of work has been repeated time and time again. Many livestock farmers have already harnessed the effect of this in recent times. British farmers spend £80 million a year on anthelmintic drugs. And there's so much potential to reduce that by using plants instead. Plants like sandfoin, birdsfoot trefoil and chicory all have natural anthelmintic properties. And by using them in seed mixtures, farmers can go some way towards offsetting worm problems. Current research work, particularly with Legume Plus, is looking at the effect that these plants have on our livestock production. And early results are very positive. And from a veterinary point of view, it is possible that farmers can use more anthelmintic plants or plants that contain these properties to reduce cost and also provide healthier animals. We talked earlier about Charles Darwin and the effect that he noticed when it came to overlapping plant species in terms of yield. But there's another big effect that farmers can get by using different species together, and that's overlapping seasons. because what you don't want is all your eggs in one basket. You want production to come as evenly as possible through the growing season so that animals have access to grazing ground, which is the cheapest form of forage, of course, for as much time as possible through the season. Grasses, for example, some of the very early ryegrasses and Cotswold can grow really early in the spring. But ryegrass in particular in dry times, as we know, stops growing in the summer. But this can be overcome by growing late season clovers and legumes, which will fill that gap. So when the grasses have stopped, the legumes come. And so by overlapping species, you can actually create much more grazing, much more evenly throughout the year. And that's such a big advantage. One of the common themes with these sort of seed mixtures is the fact that many of the plants have got very deep roots. And the deeper rooting plants, as a rule, and particularly the herbs, have access to minerals and vitamins that some of the shallower rooted plants just simply don't get. And so it's possible, by growing plants to a depth in the soil, and bear in mind that some of these plants can be 1 metre to 2 metres deep, you can actually mine these minerals and deposit them on the surface through the grazing animal. And that comes available not just for the grazing animal, but ultimately, particularly when these layers are in rotation, to human food too. Minerals such as zinc, copper, cobalt, selenium, iodine are all readily available through some of these really important forage plants. For the last 2 or 3 decades, ryegrass has been the UK's #1 species, and it's a really important plant. We've spent a lot of time and effort to breed some fantastic varieties that have provided us with just such a tremendous range of choice. I've always been struck by its brilliance on the one hand and its weakness on the other. I just want to talk about the root structure of ryegrass. Whilst it is a really important plant and it has many virtues, one of the problems is it's shallow rooted. Now, in arable rotations, which are on well-drained ground in the UK, particularly in the Midlands, the South and the East, when conditions are dry, ryegrass's roots are shallow. And that means it runs out of water, and suddenly there's a limiting factor. No matter how good its potential is, if there's no water to keep it going, and it's a shallow-rooted plant, it stops. And it's a frequent problem. Now that is different with other plants, such as these. The deep-rooting legumes, the deep-rooting grasses, and the deep-rooting herbs can play a different role, often in combination with ryegrass. Not for 1 second are we saying we shouldn't use it, just simply saying that it can be added to as part of a mixture, and you can get some really fantastic results. We can all remember our first jobs. My first job was on a mixed farm in Berkshire. Dry land, gravel land, and it was such a great experience. I look back to it now, and I feel so attached to that experience still. It's so many years ago for me. But what I remember about it, most of all, was the diversity we had on that farm. In pretty much every field there was a different crop. We had all the cereals, we had temporary lays with red clover, we had deep-rooting lucerne, we had permanent grass, woodland, we had maize, we had all sorts of different things. And the produce of those crops just kept coming back through the farming system. We fed a lot of it to our livestock. We had a dairy herd, a sheep enterprise, a beef enterprise, we had outdoor pigs and poultry, and we mill and mixed. We had a farm shop, and it just seemed like every week there was something different going on, but it all evolved around the farm, and every crop was related to a livestock, and it just was such a great self-sufficient system. And it's that lasts with me. It's that sort of leaving money in the bank and not buying in everything off, from outside of the farm. And that's what I want to come to now. And I want to see whether we can actually leave money in our bank rather than just spending it all the time on lorries coming into the farm. And we're here at Honeydale Farm, which is a farm that we took on 18 months ago. We're ever so pleased to have it. It's only a small farm in the Cotswolds, but it gives us the opportunity to really experience on a continual, ongoing basis a small farm and the issues that face it. For the first 12 months, we decided to change nothing. We were really fortunate in that Sam Lane, who works with us, was formerly farming this farm. And he spent a number of seasons growing on the top ground of this farm spring barley. And so we decided to carry on and monitor very closely what that spring barley did for the farm and the effect it was having on it, particularly from a financial point of view. We grew a really nice crop of spring barley last year. It was a good yielding crop. It had a malting premium. and we treated it as the crops had been treated previously in terms of the cultivation, the sowing, the inputs and the harvest. What was really interesting to me with that crop was the cost of production was about the same as we got for the output. In other words, we spent as much money growing that crop as we received when we sold it. This is a small farm, and there are thousands of small farms like this who have exactly the same issue. So for me, one of the challenges here is to try and come up with a new way of farming this farm, which will harness the power of the plants that we're familiar with and try and find a way of making it profitable. Now, we know why we didn't make any money on our spring barley last year. Simply, the cost of production was too high. We've illustrated here the cost of nitrogen, and you can see how the cost of nitrogen fertiliser has gone up, and that was of course one of our key inputs. We could have used any of our inputs in terms of machinery costs, in terms of contracting costs, in terms of inputs, but we've just chosen to use fertiliser, and you can see what effect this has had. And of course the end price of our produce has gone up a little bit, but nowhere near like the cost of our inputs. So this year we've decided to grow some crops that don't require many inputs. So we'll be growing sainfoin, we'll be putting in some herbal leys, some complex leys. All of these are largely self-sufficient, and we can produce healthy livestock and ultimately grow cash crops on this ground, which we hope will be more profitable. Of course, none of this is new. This book is over 100 years old, and it's called the Clifton Park Farming System, and it was written by Robert Elliott, who at the time when he wrote this was struggling to make any money on his farm. His farm was in the Scottish borders, the corn prices were really low and he couldn't make it pay. So what he decided to do was to change his farming system. He grew leys for 4 years and then he grew cash crops for 4 years afterwards. He had a ley farming system, in other words. He grew deep rooting plants that harnessed the fertility in the soil. He fixed nitrogen, he improved the soil structure, and his farm became more profitable over the years. It's a really good illustration of what happened before. Of course, that was 100 years ago, and today we have people that are doing exactly the same thing. People like Rob Richmond, for example, who is farming deep rooting leys on the thinnest of poor quality soils in the Cotswolds. And he has a really effective system at improving soil quality, producing milk, and being viable. Jonathan Boaz is another example of a farmer who is improving the soil quality. He's on a completely opposite soil. He's on the heavy lias clays. He's finding it difficult to get soil structure with continual wheat farming. So he's now growing deep rooting legumes in order to improve his soil structure, and then ultimately he will hope to improve his profitability on his farm. Interestingly for us, he's also growing leys which are providing livestock feed. Although Jonathan is a crop farmer, he's an arable farmer, he's actually growing red clover leys and lucerne, he's making hay, he's selling that off the farm and improving his farming system. In this bag is a mixture of species. It's a complex seed mixture, and this is exactly the sort of thing that we've been talking about in the last few minutes. It's what we're going to sow in this field here, and I hope that you, like me, will be enthused by these plants, and I for one find them really difficult to resist.